The sound of metal tearing, not cutting, not bending, but shattering like ceramic against concrete. A 75mm armor-piercing round hit the turret of the Type 97 Chiha with such force that the armor plate shattered, causing the gaping hole in the turret right side. The temperature that night was 27 degrees Celsius. The humidity was crushing, and inside that burning steel box on Saipan, a Japanese tank commander was confronting the mathematical reality of his situation. His Type 97 Chiha, with its proud designation as Japan's most produced tank, had just been destroyed by a single shell from an American M4 Sherman. One shot, one tank, one violent collision between ideology and physics. This is not just the story of two tanks meeting in combat. This is the story of a nation that built its entire armored philosophy around fighting an enemy that no longer existed, while an industrial democracy on the other side of the Pacific was redefining what armored warfare meant, and what it reveals about the terrifying gap between what nations tell themselves and what their enemies are actually building. June 16, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Goto sat in his command vehicle, surrounded by what Japan believed was its most formidable armored force in the Pacific. Saito launched a tank assault on the flank of the beachhead, just north of Chirankanoa, with approximately 35 Type 97 medium tanks and Type 95 light tanks and about 100 soldiers. For months, Japanese propaganda had told its people that their tanks were technically superior to anything the Americans could field. The Type 97 Chiha was the crown jewel of Imperial Japanese engineering, the most produced tank in their arsenal, with over 100 units manufactured. Tonight, Goto was about to discover that propaganda and penetration tables exist in completely different universes. What was about to unfold would be the largest Japanese armor attack of the Pacific theater of operations. It would also be a massacre, so one-sided that it would force the Japanese High Command to confront an uncomfortable truth they had been avoiding for 3 years, that their entire tank program was built on assumptions that American industrial might had rendered obsolete. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, you first need to understand what the Japanese believed about armored warfare in 1944. They believed their tanks were adequate for the threats they would face. Not just adequate, competitive. This wasn't arrogance born from ignorance. In the period between 1931 and 1938, the Japanese built nearly 700 new tanks, giving them, by 1940, the 5th largest tank force in the world. They had been successfully using armor in China for years. They had studied European tank developments. They understood the basics of armored warfare theory. But understanding theory and grasping industrial reality are two different things. The Japanese had designed their tanks to fight Chinese forces, armed with captured weapons and improvised anti-tank measures. They had optimized for a war they were already winning against an enemy that barely existed as a mechanized force. What they had not prepared for was fighting a democracy that could produce tanks faster than Japan could train crews to operate them. The Type 97 Chiha represented everything Japanese military planners thought they needed in a tank. Weighing between 14.3 to 15, 2 tons, it featured a power-to-weight ratio of 11, 3 HP ton. The bell crank suspension system supported its operational range of 210 kilometers. It was reliable, mechanically sound, and perfectly suited for the kind of warfare Japan had been fighting in Manchuria and China. Its armor thickness ranged from 15 to 25 mm, with the hull front and gun mantlet offering significant protection. By 1937 standards, this was reasonable protection. The problem was that by 1944, those standards had been obliterated by industrial democracies that had spent 3 years learning how to kill tanks more efficiently. The Chiha's armor, adequate against Chinese rifle fire and improvised explosives, was about as useful against an American 75mm tank gun as tissue paper against a sledgehammer. The Japanese did recognize some of these problems. The shortcomings of the Type 97, with its low-velocity 57-meter gun, became clear during the 1939 battles of Khalkhin Gol against the Soviet Union. Soviet tanks had outranged and outgunned the Chiha, resulting in heavy Japanese losses. This led to the development of the Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha, featuring an all-new turret design with faceted angles and a thick gun mantlet. Main armament was a high-velocity 47mm Type 1 main gun. This improved version was genuinely better, capable of penetrating some Allied armor under the right conditions. The updated 47mm gun was easily capable of dealing with the armor of the American M3 Stuart light tanks, although in later combat service it was shown only to be effective against the sides and rear of the M4 Sherman medium tank. The key phrase there is sides and rear. In tank combat, you don't get to choose which part of the enemy tank you're shooting at. But here's what the Japanese military planners didn't grasp: the scale of what they were facing. While Japan was proudly producing its most successful tank design, America was treating tank production like a manufacturing problem to be solved with assembly line efficiency. The Japanese government allowed for the manufacture of a mere 1034 tanks of all varieties in 1941 and only 290 in 1942. And these years proved to be the peak period for Japanese tank production during the entire war. In contrast, the United States built 4 00 tanks in 1941, then 24 Zinzaras the next year. Read those numbers again. Japan's peak production year produced fewer tanks than America built in a busy month. In the entire period, 1931-45, the Japanese built barely 6,500 tanks of all kinds. The Americans built approximately 49 00 Sherman tanks alone. This wasn't just a production gap. This was the difference between artisanal craftsmanship and mass production, between a nation that made tanks and a nation that manufactured them like automobiles. This production disparity created a psychological problem that Japanese commanders never fully understood. When you only have 500 tanks total, you treat each one as a precious resource to be preserved. When you have 49 Auseren of one type, you treat them as expendable tools to accomplish a mission. American tank crews knew that if their Sherman was damaged, there were dozens more where it came from. Japanese crews knew that their Chiha might be irreplaceable. Fear of loss changes how you fight. It makes you cautious when you should be aggressive, defensive when you should be attacking. And in armored warfare, hesitation is often lethal. The mathematical reality was even worse than the production numbers suggested. This was a very uneven contest, which is the main reason that in 1944 on Luzon, the Japanese were so reluctant to deploy the Chiha against the Sherman and preferred to use them as dug-in pillboxes. By 1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had essentially admitted defeat. They were no longer using tanks as tanks. They were using them as expensive, immobile gun positions. This represented a complete abandonment of everything armored warfare was supposed to accomplish. Tanks exist to provide mobile firepower, to break through enemy lines, to exploit tactical advantages. When you bury your tanks up to their turrets and use them as pillboxes, you're admitting that your equipment cannot survive in its intended role. Let's return to that night on Saipan, because what happened there illuminates the human cost of this technological gap. Led by the 44 tanks from the 9th, the Type 97s and Type 95s were knocked out by a Marine platoon of M4A2 tanks, several M3 75mm half-tracks, bazookas, and 37mm anti-tank guns. A platoon. Not a division, not a regiment. A platoon of Marines destroyed what the Japanese considered a major armored offensive. The Chiha tanks, representing years of Japanese engineering effort and months of careful tactical planning, were eliminated by a handful of American vehicles in a matter of hours. The destruction was so complete that missing rubber and piles of ash around the road wheels indicate that the tank had completely burned out. These weren't just military casualties. Each destroyed tank represented a crew of Japanese soldiers who had trained for months, who had been told they were operating superior equipment, who discovered in their final moments that everything they had been taught was a lie. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about human psychology and institutional failure. When an organization builds its entire worldview around a fundamental misunderstanding of reality, the cognitive dissonance can be overwhelming. The Japanese tank crews on Saipan weren't just facing superior American armor. They were facing the collapse of everything their military had told them about their own capabilities. Imagine being trained that your tank could compete with enemy armor, only to discover that enemy shells penetrate your armor as if it weren't there, while your own shells bounce off enemy tanks like pebbles. This isn't just tactical disadvantage. This is the violent shattering of institutional confidence. The last two campaigns of the war on Iwo Jima and Okinawa saw tank use on the part of both sides, the Japanese finally concluding that the fight against the US Army is a fight against his M4 tanks. That quote reveals everything about the psychological weight of technological inferiority. The Japanese were no longer fighting Americans. They were fighting American tanks. The infantry had become secondary to the machines. But the real tragedy is that Japan had the technical knowledge to build competitive tanks. Most tanks Japan produced during the pre-war 1930s were on par in quality with contemporary Western designs. The problem wasn't engineering capability. The problem was institutional priorities and resource allocation. However, with the beginning of the Pacific War, Japan's priorities shifted to warship and aircraft production, and resources for the production of armored vehicles for the army were diverted or curtailed. Japan made a strategic choice to focus on naval warfare at the expense of land-based armor. This wasn't necessarily wrong, given Japan's geographic situation and strategic objectives, but it meant that when Japanese tanks did encounter Allied armor, they were fighting with equipment designed for a different war against a different enemy. The Japanese did attempt to develop more competitive designs. The Japanese did produce limited numbers of heavier tanks designed to counter the new Allied threats. For example, the Type 3 Chinu, with a 75mm gun. The Type 3 Chinu was a genuinely capable design that could have competed with Allied tanks. The Chinu retained the same chassis and suspension of the Type 1 Chi-He, but with a new large hexagonal gun turret and a commander's cupola. But by the time it was ready for production, Japan's industrial infrastructure was being systematically destroyed by American bombing. Advanced Japanese tank designs, which could challenge Allied tanks, did not appear until the close of World War II. As with many innovative weapons projects launched by Japan in the final years of the war, production could not advance beyond either small numbers or the prototype stage due to material shortages, and the loss of Japan's industrial infrastructure by the Allied bombing of Japan. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of the entire story. Japan finally developed tanks that could compete with Allied designs, just as they lost the ability to build them in meaningful numbers. Think about the individual human drama behind these statistics. Every destroyed Chiha on Saipan represented not just Japanese engineering failure, but the death of soldiers who had believed in their equipment. Tank crews who had spent months learning to operate their vehicles, who had been trained to trust in Japanese technical superiority, who discovered in the most violent way possible that institutional pride and armor penetration exist in different universes. Sherman tank gunners often found their 75mm armor-piercing rounds passing right through the Type 95's thin armor, and switched to high-explosive rounds to blast the Japanese light tanks apart. American crews actually had to modify their tactics because their standard anti-tank ammunition was too effective against Japanese armor. They were over-penetrating targets that offered so little resistance that explosive rounds were more effective. That's not combat between equals. That's target practice. The aftermath of Saipan forced both sides to confront uncomfortable realities. For the Americans, it demonstrated that Japanese armor was no longer a significant threat to Allied operations. American tactical manuals were rewritten to treat Japanese tanks as obstacles to overcome, rather than threats to respect. For the Japanese, Saipan represented the collapse of their armored warfare doctrine. Older tanks continued to be used as defensive emplacements and infantry support weapons. This wasn't tactical flexibility. This was the institutional admission that Japanese tanks could no longer fulfill their primary function as mobile weapons platforms. The most produced Japanese tank of World War II had been reduced to an expensive concrete bunker. The psychological weight of this failure extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The capture of Saipan pierced the Japanese inner defense perimeter and forced the Japanese government to inform its citizens for the first time that the war was not going well. The tank battle of Saipan wasn't just a military defeat. It was a propaganda catastrophe that forced Japan to confront the gap between what it had been telling its people and what was actually happening on Pacific battlefields. When your most advanced armor is being destroyed by enemy weapons that barely seem to notice your presence, it becomes impossible to maintain the fiction that you're fighting from a position of technological equality. This brings us to the deeper philosophical question at the heart of this story. How does a nation convince itself that its equipment is adequate when evidence suggests otherwise? How do institutions maintain confidence in their capabilities when those capabilities are being systematically demonstrated as insufficient? The Japanese military's response to early tank losses against Soviet forces in 1939 was to develop better tanks. Their response to losses against American forces in 1944 was to stop using tanks as tanks. This represents a fundamental shift from problem-solving to problem-avoiding. When you can no longer compete in the intended role, you change the role rather than improve the capability. The human cost of this institutional denial was measured in burned-out tanks scattered across Pacific islands. This is a Type 97 Shinhoto, new turret, Chiha, captured by U.S. Marines on Iwo Jima, February 1945. Most Japanese armor on Iwo Jima was dug into defensive positions and camouflaged. Each of those dug-in tanks represented a crew that had been trained for mobile warfare but was now functioning as stationary artillery. The psychological impact of this role change cannot be overstated. Tank crews volunteer for mobile combat, for the adrenaline and tactical flexibility that armored warfare provides. Being buried in a hole waiting for enemy tanks to approach is psychologically devastating. It transforms aggressive warriors into passive targets. Let's examine the final numbers, because they tell a story that goes beyond simple military statistics. Japan built barely 6,500 tanks of all kinds from 1931-45. That quantity may seem trifling compared to some of the other combatants. For instance, the Germans built more than 2,400 battle tanks of over 10 tons alone. The Americans churned out some 49 Eozo-era Shermans, not to mention their other types. In 1942-45, the Soviets produced some 40 Eozo-Ndalas T-34s alone, 1940-45. These aren't just production statistics. They represent fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. Japan approached tank production like a traditional military power, building relatively small numbers of vehicles for specific tactical situations. America approached tank production like an industrial democracy, solving a manufacturing problem at scale. The result was that American tank crews faced equipment shortages rarely, while Japanese crews faced equipment shortages constantly. This production disparity created psychological effects that influenced every aspect of Pacific tank warfare. American crews could afford to be aggressive because they knew replacement vehicles were available. Japanese crews had to be cautious because their tanks were irreplaceable. The 40mm gun on the Type 97 could only penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at close range, or the weaker side armor if presented with that opportunity. Japanese tank tactics devolved into ambush warfare, not because it was tactically superior, but because it was the only way their equipment could potentially succeed. They had to get close enough to target weak armor, because their weapons couldn't penetrate frontal protection at normal combat ranges. This turned every tank engagement into a desperate gamble rather than a tactical operation. The Type 97 Chiha's story illuminates something profound about the relationship between industrial capacity and military confidence. Japan's most produced tank couldn't survive contact with American armor, not because Japanese engineers lacked skill, but because Japanese industry lacked scale. The M4A3, on the other hand, had a far superior firepower advantage, able to penetrate the Type 97's armor at normal combat ranges. This wasn't just technological superiority. This was the mathematical result of democratic industrial capacity applied to military problems. When you can build tanks by the tens of thousands, you can afford to optimize for performance rather than resource conservation. When you can only build tanks by the hundreds, every design decision becomes a compromise between what you want and what you can afford. The final irony is that the Type 97 Chiha succeeded brilliantly at its intended mission. It was designed to support infantry against lightly equipped Chinese forces, and in that role, it performed excellently for years. The Type 97 was deployed in China in combat operations in the Second Sino-Japanese War, with considerable success, as the ill-equipped National Revolutionary Army of the Republic of China forces were limited to only 3 tank battalions consisting of British exports of the Vickers, German Panzer IS, and Italian CV-33 tankettes. The problem wasn't that the Chiha was a bad tank. The problem was that by 1944, it was fighting a completely different war against a completely different enemy than it had been designed to face. Japanese tank designers had optimized for 1937. American tank designers had optimized for 1943. The results were predictably one-sided. The Saipan ratio, 1 killed American and several wounded for every 7 Japanese soldiers killed, became one of the justifications for American planners to increase conscription, projecting an increased need for replacements in the war on Japan. This statistical brutality wasn't just the result of superior American weapons. It was the result of institutional decisions made years earlier about resource allocation and strategic priorities. Japan had chosen to fight a naval war with aircraft carriers and battleships. America had chosen to fight an industrial war with overwhelming production capacity applied to every category of military equipment. When these two approaches collided on Pacific battlefields, the results were mathematically predictable and psychologically devastating. What happened to the Type 97 Chiha reveals something universal about the relationship between national mythology and military reality. Every nation tells itself stories about its capabilities, its technological superiority, its special advantages. These stories are necessary for morale and institutional confidence, but when those stories diverge too far from measurable reality, the correction comes through violence. The Japanese believed their tanks were competitive because they had to believe it. The alternative was admitting that their entire armored warfare doctrine was based on assumptions that no longer applied. Despite the relatively anemic overall production, Japanese tanks did appear on a wide number of battlefields throughout Asia and the Pacific, and as will be seen below, they often made a significant contribution to victory in the period of greatest Japanese success. The Chiha did exactly what it was designed to do, until it encountered an enemy that had redefined what tanks were supposed to be capable of. The burned-out hulks on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and dozens of other Pacific battlefields represent more than just military failure. They represent the collision between institutional confidence and industrial reality, between what nations tell themselves and what their enemies are actually building. After World War II, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers ceased all military manufacturing and development plants in Japan, making the country lose the technology to build and manufacture tanks and armored vehicles. Japan's tank program didn't just fail militarily. It was completely eliminated as a security threat by Allied occupation policy. The nation that had built the 5th largest tank force in the world by 1940 was prohibited from building any armored vehicles at all. In the end, the Type 97 Chiha's legacy isn't about Japanese engineering failure. It's about the terrifying speed with which military technology can render previous generations of equipment obsolete. It's about the psychological weight of discovering that everything your institution taught you was true is actually a comfortable lie. It's about the human cost of fighting a war with tools designed for a different conflict against a different enemy. The Chiha was Japan's most produced tank, not because it was the best tank Japan could build, but because it was the best tank Japan could afford to build in the quantities they thought they needed. When those quantities proved insufficient and that quality proved inadequate, institutional pride collided with penetration tables. Physics won. The men inside those burning tanks lost, and the mathematics of industrial warfare were written across Pacific islands in steel and fire. The sound of metal tearing. That's how this story began, and that's how it ends. Not with mechanical failure or tactical error, but with the violent intersection of ideology and engineering. The Type 97 Chiha couldn't survive a single Sherman shell, because it had been designed to fight an enemy that no longer existed against threats that had evolved beyond its capabilities. Japan's most produced tank became a monument to the gap between what nations believe about themselves and what their enemies are actually capable of achieving. In the end, that gap is measured not in armor thickness or penetration values, but in the distance between institutional pride and industrial reality. And on the battlefields of the Pacific War, that distance was exactly the difference between survival and catastrophic failure.